Okay, so this is a continuation, I guess, of the previous shiur, and this will be, as I last time we discussed primarily the perhaps some of the sources for the whole idea of Amira la'akum, and we discussed whether it might have its roots in the Deoraita, or it's something which is totally rabbinic with different various ramifications. I'm not going to rehash that. I'll touch one point about that in just one moment, but it also connects as we continue the discussion. This is not on the sheet, because I guess had I realized that when I forwarded the sheets that I would have had, I worked hard to get it into two sides. Okay, so just one flip thing, and I cut down on sources and whatever, and then in the transmission, it suddenly became 4 sheets. So or 3.5. So had I known that I had more room, so then I would have put this in, but I didn't. In this week's parsha, and of course in the Aseret HaDibrot, so you have the mitzvah of Shabbat features prominently as the fourth of the Dibrot. And there, the Torah says, "V'yom hashvi'i Shabbat l'Hashem Elokecha lo ta'aseh chol melacha." So this is the Shabbat for God, and do not do any, we'll say, creative activity. I think that's the best, not exact translation, but gets the idea of what that is, and we've discussed that in the past, and we'll touch upon it again just one more in one moment. But Ata uvincha. So now there's a list of people who are included. Ata, you, bincha uvitecha, your son, your daughter, avdecha va'amatcha uvehemtecha, your servants, be they male, female, your animals, the gerecha asher b'sharecha, and the stranger in your gates. Okay, so the question, what is this idea? So we spoke about this idea, there's a concentric circle that's working around here. And here are the Ramban points this out. It's already predates the Ramban in terms of different aspects of it, and the Ramban is working off of the different midrashei halacha. But the Ramban, for example, says, Ata uvincha uvitecha haktanim. Well, this refers to your children while they are still katanim, they're still minors. They are not they do not have their own chiyuv. He's harnu b'Shabbat shelo yasu habanim aktanim melacha ledatenu uvirtzonenu. So here the Ramban says there's a specific isur to have your child, and the emphasis on your child, even though that child is a minor, to do the melacha, that reflects back on the parent. Once it's here, and it works in well, because what's the next after you say bincha bitecha? So then it's avdecha va'amatecha, your servants, and then it's basically the Torah is building concentric circles. You are, I like to always say, I'm in the Susman centric view of the universe. I'm in the middle of everything. Okay, and you can, your name here, centric view of the universe, when we're all there in the middle. And so then we have our concentric circles around us. So first our family, and then our servants, and then behemtecha, our property. All right, so here there's happens to be a machloket with regard to behemah. There's no machloket. In other words, if I were to, it's less of an issue today, because we generally don't have beasts of burden. But But actually, a student of mine asked a question a few years back. He said, if I could train my dog to turn the light on, right? So can I do that on Shabbat? So that's exactly what the Torah is here saying is asur. And when there is an isur, what's called mechamer, because the most common animal of working animal in the time of the I guess maybe throughout human history was the donkey, the mule. So it's called, the isur is actually called mechamer. In other words, if I have an animal, any animal, do work for me, so that is a isur d'oraita. It's not on the same level as doing the melacha myself. It's not a chiyuv skila, but it is an isur to do that. But then I come to the gercha asher b'sharecha. Right. So here, because this becomes very important, because gercha, to our question in terms of Amira l'nochri. So gercha asher b'sharecha. So the Ramban says al derech hapshat who ger tzedek. Who chayav kamonu b'shvita. In other words, this is referring to the gercha asher b'sharecha is referring to not the ger toshav, not the resident who is a non-Jew, but is accepted upon himself or herself to keep the Sheva mitzvah b'nei Noach and to accept the jurisdiction of the Jewish government, etc. But rather, we're talking about what we would call a ger, namely a convert, and the idea here is to including this idea, and then the question then becomes, well, what about the ger toshav? And the Ramban continues and talks about how the ger toshav, because he's b'sha'arecha, because he's in your gates, and he's becomes a part of the community, so then there is an isur for him, not an isur for him or her to do melacha for themselves, but there is an isur to do melacha for us. Right? So this is a different level than the nachri. Whereas the nachri that we've been talking about is a person who isn't a ger toshav. It's not a resident, we'd call a resident, a legal alien. Perhaps that would be the best translation in modern English. But rather, it's a person who is just a non. It could be a pagan. At times, it could be a person who's just not a ger toshav. Is not so. As a result, is a part of the communal circle. But that, as we've seen and we've spoken about before, is an isur d'Rabbanan, not the d'oraita. Though we saw that there were those deyot that said it was d'oraita. Now, with that in mind, now we come back to just to touch upon one idea again that we spoke about 2 weeks ago, but to my mind, it's such a critical idea, I just want to repeat it. And that's before we get to the new Makorot, so just the Ramban again in Vayikra, not the Ramban here. And the Ramban says, again, the idea of Shabbaton, and here just a much more condensed version than what we said last time. Nirid li, in the second line, Shamidrash hazeh lomar shenitztavinu min haTorah liyot lanu menucha biyom tov afilu midvarim she'inan melacha lo sheyitrach kol hayom. In other words, when the Ramban introduces the mitzvat aseh of Shabbaton, which is here is in that particular context it's Yom Tov, but it applies to Shabbat as well, that is referring to a situation where he gives a definition that you should not be bothered. You shouldn't be working. In other words, I said melacha before was constructive activity. I know it's something which changes. Let's say just a simple situation. I bake something. So I have dough and now I have bread. It's undergone a chemical change through the baking process, and it is qualitatively different than what existed before. All right, so that would be a good example of a definition of melacha. If I schlep things, I work really hard, I build up a big sweat doing it. That's not melacha. In other words, the tables, that are here. So the tables are pretty heavy. And you move them around, but the tables are the same tables, right? I'm the same person, just, maybe a little more tired than I was before. And nothing has really changed fundamentally. But we might all agree that in terms of calories burnt, in terms of working, it was harder to move the tables than to put the dough into the oven. Right? But the one is creative, and that's why it becomes a melacha. The other is just what the Ramban calls torach. It's just burden. It's a burdensome activity. So burdensome activities are not isur d'oraita in terms of the lo tase. They are included in the mitzvat aseh. And so for that I explained, I said this, and the Ramban gives his description of the medieval marketplace, which I didn't quote here. And he says, okay, so now let's look at the pecking order. Right? So v'hinei huzharu al melachot b'shabbat b'lav v'onesh karet umita v'hatrachim v'hamel ba'aseh zeh. In other words, I have the highest level is doing the creative activity. That's the lo tase. The next activity, and of course, if I do the lo tase, that also includes the aseh, because if I'm doing creative activity, so then I am clearly also not keeping to Shabbaton. Then I have the next level, where I don't have the creative activity, but I have the burden. Trachim v'ha'amal ba'aseh zeh. So that's the burden. Okay, and then we'll skip down to the next bold print. V'zeh min Torah, and all of this is Torah level. She'ilu b'divreihem kol davar she'eino oseh eino omer legoy v'oseh. Sha'afilu b'shvut Amira hichmiru ba. Whereas the Ramban now says that I want to now add to this the rabbinic layer. Right? The doraita layer, the lo tase is if I do the melacha. The aseh is if I have burdensome activity. The rabbinic level is if I ask a non-Jew to do the melacha for me. So here, I'm not in violation of Shabbaton, the Ramban says, because I didn't really do anything. Because ultimately, all I did was ask the non-Jew. Yeah, right? Talk is cheap on the Doraita level. Okay? Unless it's Lashon Hara. Talk is cheap. Right? But when it comes to the Chachamim recognized this loophole, right? Saw it for what it was, and that, what the Ramban calls Shvut Amira, the resting of speech. Okay, that is rabbinic. Now, again, here the Ramban is making this point, and in terms of Shabbos, the question then becomes, okay, this is where the Ramban drew the line. Those opinions that we spoke about last time, who said it was Doraita, they're basically saying that the line should be drawn somewhere else. In other words, if through my, through my volition, their activity is done on Shabbat, whether it's done by non-Jew, whether it's done by animal, whatever it is, I'm creating the basis for this work to be done. That might be a doraita according to those opinions. Where the Ramban is saying no. The question is, am I physically? Am I, from a labor perspective, am I involved? If I'm involved, it's a doraita. If I'm not involved, it's a dorabanan. Okay, that's where the Ramban draws the line. As we said last time, the overwhelming majority of poskim, and certainly what Jewish custom has become, in terms of the halachic status, is to view this as, meaning Amira la'akum, asking a non-Jew, as a rabbinic prohibition, a rabbinic violation, not a doraita violation. So this is the consensus, if you will, with regard to the halachic position. The idea, it's a nice example to point to, the idea, sometimes people say, well, when there's a machlok, it will always be machmir. Mm-hmm. Right? So here, that's not the case. There's a clear machloket, right? And there are many well, maybe many is overstating it, but there are more than a few poskim who view that it is a d'oraita amongst the Rishonim, but the halachic consensus has basically said, no, we don't accept that approach. And we are following it as a din d'Rabbanan and not a din d'oraita.
What's the big difference in the result?
Okay, so there are going to be different issues that are involved. The most important question is going to be, well, under what circumstances? These are not going. Maybe I'll touch upon it at the end of this year today. The third shir, I don't know when that will be, but the third shir will talk more on the nitty-gritty level of the halachot, in terms of the when is Amira la'akum permissible, when is it not permissible, and so on, along those lines.
But what's the consequence of it?
Of it being D'Rabbanan? So one major consequence is, are we going to be willing to, or when will we be willing to be mekel? For example, if there is a mitzvah that needs to be done, and it will not occur if I don't have a non-Jew to do it for me. Or as I ask, I need a...
you want to carry up these tables to the shul upstairs.
To the shul upstairs, or I need, the case of the Gemara, and there's a bris, and I need the knife, but there's no eruv, and it's in a different house. Can I ask a non-Jew to bring the knife? Right? If I can't bring the baby, I can't bring the baby because same problem in the other direction, right? Right. So what do I do? Right. So do I push off the bris for if a person is ill, but not deathly ill, not a cholesh yesh bo sakana, cholesh ein bo sakana. So I will be more likely to be mekel when it's an Isur d'Rabbanan than I will if it's an Isur d'Oraita. Okay, so that's an important consequence. When can I use this, if you will? When can I dispense of it? If I have a need. Now, what that need is, that I'm not going to talk about right now. Okay, yeah.
How it's the case of a caregiver for a disabled or elderly person?
Correct.
Yeah. Now answer the question both whether it's a non-Jewish person who's hired for the job.
Okay, so that's exactly what I'm not talking about today. That is a very important case. That's a critical case. But I'm trying to build it. The first level was trying to understand Doraita, D'Rabbanan, this whole concept of Shvut, Shabbaton, etc. Next level, which is what I'm about to get to, is accepting the fact that it's D'Rabbanan. What is the mechanism that the Rabbanan shows? And is there a difference in terms of halacha l'maaseh? Do we care what the mechanism is? Okay, that's today's shir. And then the next shir will be, okay, we understand what the mechanism is, and this is the halacha. Now, on a practical level, dealing with all sorts of cases. Whether it's a mitzvah, whether it's a chol she'ein bo sakana, etc. Does a person who is disabled, a person who is elderly, where do they fall on that spectrum, etc. And all of these questions need to be addressed, but I'm not going to get to it today. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the cases in the Gemara. So we're up to in the first sheet, source number 1, Aleph 1, and this is, as you could see from the title of the section, of the subsection of the Roman numeral 1, Shlichut. In other words, to understand that what is the problem from a rabbinic perspective is that I'm turning the non-Jew into an agent on my behalf, and that's the problem. Okay, so just to show you, this is something that Rashi talks about in several cases, and along the way we'll see different cases. It's also very helpful to see different cases as we go along to get a fuller picture of what the discussion's all about. So here the source number 1, Nachri Shabala Chabad, a non-Jew who comes to extinguish a fire. Now we have to be, here I will talk halacha l'maaseh. This is a halacha, this Mishnah is almost an irrelevant Mishnah. What do I mean by that? Because in virtually every situation, the Mishnah is assuming that we're not dealing with a pikuach nefesh situation. There's a fire, it can be, even if it burns out of control, it's under control. It will not spread. It's now just simply a question of the monetary damage that will that I'm going to have to absorb. That's really the only question. There isn't a concern, right? All the people have been evacuated, and I know that the house is separated from any other isolated property, and it's not going to be a problem, right? So as I said, irrelevant probably is too strong a word. It is almost any given situation that we'd be familiar with in terms of a fire. There is a concern that it's going to spread, right? We've seen these things. You just have to check the news every now and then. But in this case, so you have on this isolated property, the fire is burning, and a non-Jew appears, and he wants to extinguish the fire. Ein omrim lo kabeh v'al techabeh. You don't have to tell him anything, right? Don't. Mipnei she'ein shvitato aleha. In other words, he comes, right? The fire department shows up, and they want to extinguish the fire. So you say, okay. I'm not telling you to extinguish it. I'm not telling you not to extinguish it. Right? You do whatever fire departments do. Okay, fine. So they extinguish it. Aval katan, but here it's important. But if a minor comes, a Jewish minor, shabal chabot ein shomin lo mipnei shvitatan alehen. So here, if it's a katan, and it's not even the katan that we were talking about before of your katan, but rather it's any katan, so then you discourage the child from doing so, because we have a responsibility, and this is a different discussion about the katan. I don't want to get into it now because then we won't get into the second source. And that is basically, no, we do have a responsibility. Where is that level? Maybe that'll be the fourth shiur, the fifth shiur. We could talk about katanim. Now we say the following. Gemara explains, Amir v'ami, b'dleikai tiru lomar kol ha'mechabe eino mafsid. If there's a fire, we go one step further. That if there's a fire, you can say, whoever extinguishes it, I'll make it worth your while. Eino mafsid. That person's not wasting his time. Again, I'm not directing someone to do it, but I'm just saying I start screaming in the neighborhood, right? Fire! Anyone who comes and extinguishes it, it'll be worth your while. Okay. So fine. Name a Messiah. So now the Gemara says, this was a statement of Ravami, who's an Amora. So the Gemara says, we can bring our Mishnah as a support for what Ravami just said. Nachri shabal chabot ein omrim lo kabeh v'al techabeh mipnei she'ein shvitato alehen kabehu de lo amrinan le. Right? You can't tell him to extinguish. Ha kol ha'mechabeh eino mafsid amrinan le. But if you can say it in a more, in a broader, less directed fashion, the way that Rav Ami had said. Rashi explains, number 2, Kabeu de lo amrinan le, sha'oseyu shlucho mamash. What's the problem? If I go to the non-Jew and I say, please extinguish the fire, I have in effect appointed him as my shaliach. I have appointed him as my agent to do this, and that's the problem. But if I say, Kol ha'mechabe eino mafsid, so then, Nachri midate didei avid sharia. But then, it's far enough removed that this isn't I'm not directing the non-Jew, he's not my agent, he is an intelligent human being and he's able to figure out what I wanted him to do, but he's not acting as my agent, he's acting on my behalf perhaps, but he's not acting as an agent. Okay? Now, whereas here, perhaps we're going to, and there's a discussion. how far do we take this? Is this only in case of a fire where there's a clear, serious monetary loss? For example, the next case, where the Gemara, and this is a discussion which I don't want to get into right now in terms of, I'll just mention that you'll see where the problem comes up when we look at the case. Mi sheikh shich baderech, okay, number 3. A person is now traveling, and it's getting close to Shabbat. So he's in and they're outside of a town. Noten kisol l'nochri. So then he can take his wallet and give it to the non-Jew who is traveling with him, because he can't carry it himself. And here is a good example of the difference between giving it to a non-Jew and doing what we might think is less of a problem. V'im eni mo nochri. If you don't have a non-Jew, you're traveling by yourself, and it's an area you have to keep traveling, it's dangerous, whatever the reason. Menicho al chamor. So then you can put it on your donkey. In other words, putting it on your donkey is worse than giving it to the non-Jew. Because if I put it on my donkey, so then I'm having my animal work on my behalf. That's an Isur D'Oraita. That's in my concentric circle. It's one of the concentric circles. If I give it to a non-Jew, so then the non-Jew is, again, he's not my responsibility. So he's doing whatever actions he does, but I am appointing him, as we're going to see again, as a shaliach. And that's the problem. So he giya l'chatzer chitzona notelet hakelim anitalim mishabat. Okay, so then there's a discussion. What happens when I reach the edge of town? Not my issue right now. I just brought the whole Mishnah. The Gemara says, "My tama sharu rabbanan lemetav kisei denachri." Why did the Chachamim allow me to give my wallet to a non-Jew? Kimle l'ruhu rabbanan de'ein adam ma'amid atzmo al mamona. So the Rabbanan understand the psychology of people, and and generally speaking, is if I am going to incur a significant loss, I'm not going to be able to withstand the temptation. If you don't allow me to give it to the non-Jew, I might carry it myself. And so, under those circumstances, I could ask the non-Jew. Now, just one thing to remember, we seem to be talking about a case where it's before Shabbat. It's hichshich. So I'm giving it to the non-Jew before Shabbat, right? And with the expectation that he's going to continue the work into Shabbat. Well, we'll talk about that. So here, Rashi says, "My tamashavile lemetav lenachri, harehu shlucho lisaenu b'Shabbat." So the reason why it is, the Gemara is saying, why should it be mutter? After all, you're appointing him a shaliach. And the Gemara's answer is that it's true, you're appointing him a shaliach, but it will prevent less of more of an avera. So it's important to do the lesser transaction rather than the transgression. Rather than the greater transgression. Okay, that's the Gemara. But here, and this is why there's seems to be a slight contradiction. Remember, if my house is on fire, right, that's more than my wallet, right? And so there with the house, I have to, I can't just say it, right? But here, I can actually ask the non-Jew. I can pull out my wallet and give it to him, and just say, okay, please take my wallet, right, and carry it into town for me. Right? So what's the difference? After all, if I'm concerned about, if I'm worried that I'm going, so I certainly should be worried that I'm going to perhaps extinguish the fire myself, if I can't ask the non-Jew, right? So this is a big discussion, right? Because there are all sorts of other cases that we have similar discussions about, without getting into it right now. But one of the distinctions between the first case and the second case is that the second case, which we'll get to in a moment, the second case is talking about before Shabbat. Whereas I'm not actually telling the non-Jew to do anything on Shabbat itself. The consequences will take place on Shabbat. But my action is taking place before Shabbat. Or my speech, yeah.
So if you have a fire in your house on Shabbat and there's no one around, and you call the fire department.
So as I said, today, right, unless you have a piece of property which is on an island, surrounded by water, right, and it will not spread to anywhere, right? So then you can pick up the phone and call, right? Besides the fact that calling is only an Issur D'Rabbanan anyway, right? But because we all remember, fires where it starts relatively localized and spreads over, dozens of, hundreds even of square kilometers, right? It just starts in one place and just spreads. So, as I said, if there's a fire, it's definitely a safek pikuach nefesh today, right? It probably was even then, for the most part. They might have. Look, it also depends on the nature of the building material and how much it can spread, etc. Today, I think there are many more flammable things around than the Gemara was talking about. So, as I said, halacha l'maaseh, if there's a fire, call the fire department, right? Or for that matter, again, figuring out, call the fire department. Okay. Or put it out yourself if you think that it's going to be if it's going to spread before the fire department gets to it. Tough. So Rashi again talks about it being a case of agency. Another case. Number 5. Lo yomar Yisrael ove kochavim tol kelkecha b'Shabbat. That you and va'ani b'chol, the lamed got cut off. I'm sorry. So basically here's another very important example of historically speaking of Amira la'akum, where I have a business partner and a non-Jewish business partner, and it's a type of business enterprise that remains open on Shabbat. So the easiest way of handling it is saying, okay, I will take the profits we'll split the profits, and then on the Friday profits are mine, and the Shabbat profits are yours. Right? So that you can't do. Right? And we have to talk about what you can do, but that will probably be class number 4. What?
What's the reason why you can't?
Why? So the reason that you can't is because, in effect, we'll take a look at the Rashi. It starts on the bottom there. The Rashi says, "Lo mar Yisrael tolata chelkecha b'Shabbat lefi shenaseh shlucho al chatzi hayom hamutal alav." Since normally speaking, and there are ways around this, not surprisingly, Jews are very creative people. But but basically saying, look, we're partners, so that means it's 50-50. On any given day, any given moment, any given profit. So now when I say, you just have Shabbat, and I have Friday, so basically I've given you my half, and I've appointed you an agent for my half. Right? So then we have to work out the wording so that becomes not a problem, not an issue, and that has been done, right, in order to do it. But the simplest way of just simply saying, I'll take Friday, you take Shabbat, that doesn't work, because really I should have Shabbat, or half of Shabbat, and I'm in effect having you work for me on Shabbat, and I'm working for you on Friday, and that becomes a problem. But the idea here again is that Rashi uses that term shlucho, that he's your agent. Yeah.
What if you're a shareholder in a large company? I mean, you're technically one of the many millions and millions of owners.
Okay, so again, without getting into the details, sheer 6. But basically, here you're touching about 2 different things, okay, which have to be taken into account. One is, what is the halachic status of a corporation? In other words, here or a limited liability corporation. So, does halacha recognize a corporation as a separate entity, which is what legally occurs, right? If my corporation, I could be the even 100% shareholder of the corporation, but you can't sue me personally. You can only sue the corporation. That's exactly, the nature of the corporation. It has its own identity, legally speaking. So I'm only liable to the extent of my shares in the company, but you can't sue me personally. Right? Does halacha recognize that? That's a relatively recent invention, which has allowed businesses to develop and societies to develop. But does halacha recognize it, or am I ultimately still the person in charge? And then, assuming that, and that, by the way, has all sorts of different ramifications in terms of, let's say, in terms of chametz on Pesach. Right? If I have a corporation that owns the chametz and is producing the chametz, so is that me producing the chametz? Right? I don't really own it; it's the corporation that owns it. So that's one level. And then, assuming that halacha doesn't recognize it, is there a distinction between a privately owned company and a public corporation? Right? That's another question. So the general halachic consensus is that if I'm a shareholder, let's say in McDonald's, right, I'm not over at the Isurim because they are cooking basar b'chalav together. Because my share in McDonald's, even if I own 1,000 shares of McDonald's, still is not. Since it's a publicly owned company, publicly sold company, so then it's not, right. Whereas if I had my own company, privately owned company, private equity, and it is it's McDonald's, right, before it goes public, so then that's more problematic. Right? But that's a good question. Yeah.
I guess there's difference where you says we split the weekday profits and you keep the Shabbat profits.
Right. So then again, each case is going to be different. How to get around it, and we can, and any one of these cases, we could probably have a full shiur just focusing on that one particular case, maybe even more than one shiur. Right. So okay. But right now, I'm just trying to build the framework so we can move forward. Okay. Number 8. This is actually not in a case of Shabbat. Here the question is with regard to other isurim. The Gemara in Bava Metzia asks the question and doesn't give a definitive answer as to whether or not this notion of Amira la'akum, of having a non-Jew do something on my behalf, applies only on Shabbat, or does it also apply to other isurim? So, for example, the case that this has important halachic ramifications. There's an isur to neuter an animal. Nisur d'oraita, the Torah says so explicitly. So it's asur for me to neuter an animal. Can I have a non-Jewish vet do the procedure for me? Right? My animal, have non-Jewish vet do it for me. Is that mutar or asur? So that's what the Gemara is dealing with. And so Rashi says the following. But he says the following: Bishlam Aseifa Diktani Im Hamidu Eitzel Yisrael Asher Demashva Shenachrize Chashuv Shlucho Shel Yisrael. And here's the important. You know what? I skipped number 7. Oh, I have to build it. I'm sorry. Go back one step. This whole idea of agency, right, is assuming that I can make a non-Jew my shaliach. Right? Otherwise, if I were to ask the non-Jew to go and do something on my behalf, for example, let's say, take Trumot and Masrot on my behalf. That's the Gemara's case. Right? I have produce. I can appoint a shaliach to do it for me. And so now I ask my non-Jewish neighbor, I give him the details, and I tell him exactly what needs to be done, what needs to be given to the Kohen, what needs to be given to the Levi, etc., etc. Goes down the list. And I just say, please do this for me, so that way that I can use the produce.
If he is
if he has the Sheva Mitzvot L'Bnei Noach, okay?
Right.
In that framework, this is something that's like the same shita. The Jew has this, and the non-Jew has that. But suppose to just somebody who's not religious, bichlal, not Jewish, bichlal. He's your neighbor. You're living in a neighborhood somehow.
Right.
Is that different?
That doesn't seem to be different. It doesn't seem to be
just
different.
not being a Jew.
Right. We're talking about a non-Jew. So here, right. So correct.
That as being part of it.
Right. We're not talking about one of those. So the Gemara says, number 7. The Gemara says that Amira v'anai gamatem. There's a pasuk that says that you. And this is regard to the taking trumot to Maasrot. The pasuk says that Gam atem, you as well will take the trumot. And the Gemara says, what is this gam atem? Ma atem b'nei brit, av shluchachem b'nei brit. Well, just as to create an agency, so basically, when it comes to having an agent do something on my behalf, when it comes to mitzvot at least, so then, if business partners and having an agent doing business work, that might be fine. But in terms of acting as my, instead of me, whether it's in terms of isurim, violations, or whether it's in terms of mitzvot, so there we need to share the common basis. You're stepping in my shoes, in effect, when you're my agent. So that means that the shoes have to fit you. If you don't have a chiyuv of Trumot Masrot, so then you can't take Trumot Masrot from me. It just doesn't work.
Even if he's paid.
What?
Even if he's paid.
Even if he's paid, right. In other words, the ritual connection doesn't work. So by the same token, it goes in the other direction. If it's Shabbat, so you're acting as my agent, right? But you're not really acting as my agent because Shabbat doesn't mean anything to you. So so what's going on? So here Rashi says, this is the number 8. As I said, he's talking about not with regard to Shabbat, but it's important for us to see this. He says, Chumra derabanan hu lemesar. It's not really that he's a shaliach for me. It's just that the Rabbanan are looking to close loopholes. That's what they just are. They've created the Isser, and at the same time, they also want to make sure that people don't take advantage of the system. And so we are trying to close as many loopholes as possible. And so while we're closing the loophole here is to say, well, okay, it's a chumra derabanan. We recognize that you're not really a shaliach on my behalf. But we are going to treat you as a shaliach because it looks like you're a shaliach, right? If I ask you to do something on my behalf, it's pretty clear that you're acting on my behalf. So technically speaking, halachically, doraita, you're not my agent. But you walk like a shaliach, you talk like a shaliach, you quack like a shaliach, so you're a shaliach. That's basically it, right, when it comes to chumrah. When it comes to mitzvot, on the other hand, in terms of giving it the impact that you have taken the truma, that we won't do. But in terms of preventing isurim being done by using the non-Jew, that we will do. Yeah.
How does that fit in with a caretaker of a shul?
Okay, so again, I don't want to get there, right? We will get there, but not today because I only have 15 more minutes. Okay, so now we have this this particular halacha, and here when it comes to this idea of, as I said, Rashi doesn't talk about those terms, the chumrah with regard to Shabbat, but other Rishonim, source number 9, says explicitly that when it comes to shlichut, yesh shlichut l'nochri l'chumrah. Okay, when it comes to Amir La'akum. So the first approach is to say, what has happened? Why? Again, it's rabbinic. What is the mechanism? It's a form of shlichut, of agency, and I look at the non-Jew as working on my behalf. Okay, fine. Next approach is, which also finds its way in Rashi, and it's a little beyond us right now. The truth is, I haven't quite figured out why Rashi has both answers. I have an idea, maybe I'll mention it. But Rashi gives a different explanation based on the Pasuk in Yeshayahu. Pasuk says, Im tashib b'shabbat raglacha, asod chavatzecha b'yom kodshei, וקראת לשבת עונג לקדוש השם מכובד וחיבתו מעשות דרכיך ממצוא חפצך ודבר דבר. So here, this is a Navi speaking. It's not D'oraita, but it's more, if you will, more than D'Rabbanan. And here, we've seen this pasuk before, that the idea of treating Shabbat like Shabbat. How do I treat like Shabbat? Like Shabbat, basically not doing your normal activities and calling it, and this is the source for the idea of Oneg Shabbat and Kvod Shabbat, making it special in different ways. And then, me'asot drachecha mimtzo cheftecha, doing your normal activities, bidaber davar, and speech, which isn't Shabbostic speech. Well, so what is that daber davar? Right? Aside, I've told my own children and my students, whenever they're at my Shabbos table, you can talk about anything you want, except for sports and pop culture. That's daber davar, right? You can't speak about that, right? And you don't think about it, but maybe 80% of our conversations, right? Maybe not the sports part, depends on the age group, but the pop culture, that takes a lot. So everything else, so that is the question, of course, is when does pop culture become history? That's the real question. 1960s television shows. Okay. Anyway, the point though is that so Rashi here applies it to Amira la'akum. So he says when it comes to purchasing, we didn't see the case this time. We saw it last time. That's the case of purchasing. Asking a non-Jew to act as my agent to buy land in Eretz Yisrael on Shabbat. So Rashi says that would be a problem. If I have him acting as my agent, what's the problem? Because lomar lovei kochavim aseli kach zeu mishum mimso chefzecha v'daber davar. Right. So this is the problem. So the idea is that I'm doing something which is, we would say, is problematic. The Rambam phrases it a little differently. Rambam, when he talks about the Isur of Amira la'akum, number 12, he says, Davar zeh asur, just the bold, midivrei sofrim, kidei shelo tiyeh Shabbat kala be'enehem. In order that Shabbat not be something which is just simply, something to find a loophole for, and then v'yavo lasot be'atzmam, and the moment that you allow for something, even if it's through the agency of the non-Jew, and I'm not talking about in terms of shlichut here, but then it becomes it will lead to mixed dancing, as they would say. In other words, it will lead to the fact you yourself will violate Shabbat because you're not being careful about Shabbat. Just as an example, it's not exactly the same thing. I not too long ago I was reading a description of one of the people who lived in Shanghai, who escaped to Shanghai from the Mir Yeshiva during the war, and there was a question which we spoke about once about how many days of Shabbat should you keep there. In other words, where's the date line halachically? So there was a question whether Shanghai is on this side, that side, or is when they're calling it Saturday, is that really Shabbat, or is what they call Sunday Shabbat? So one approach, which the students did there, or different people, was basically this treat what we call Saturday, we call the Shabbat for everything, but on Sunday they wouldn't do any D'oraitas. They would only do D'Rabbanans. Right? We treat it just as the D'Rabbanans and the D'Oraitas. So that was one approach. And so the testimony, which I found very interesting, was that he was shocked by how many D'Oraitas they violated. In other words, once they weren't doing the D'Rabbanans, inadvertently they were saying, okay, these were Talmidei Chachamim. They knew the differences, but because they were doing the D'Rabbanans, inadvertently they would do things that were D'Oraita, and then they'd be, oh my gosh, I did the D'Oraita. The D'Rabbanans acting as a fence really works. So that is okay, so that's what the Rambam is saying in terms of Amira La'akum. If I allow doing Melacha through the non-Jew, the next time I'll flip on the light switch. Okay, so that's the problem. Now, what's the difference between these different approaches? Because you have this, if you will, the first approach is to say, on a technical level, he's acting as my agent, and on the other level, it's more of an ideological position, if you will. It's saying, okay, I'm looking at it, I want Shabbat to be more special for one reason or another, and I don't really care if it's the actually is considered to be shlichut per se. We'll skip source number 13 right now. Go to 14, and this is the a posek from the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the Avnei Nezer, the Sukkah Shavua Rav Avram Bornstein, and he makes a distinction. He says that basically I can say the following: that if it is, because this is the question is, and we already saw one case of this. Amira La'akum applies, or does it apply, before Shabbat, for Shabbat, on Shabbat, for after Shabbat? Whereas if I tell the non-Jew, and I say, listen, it's very dark here, can you please turn on the light for me? Right? Okay, so then we understand that's Amira La'akum. What if I tell the non-Jew, before Shabbat, tomorrow, please make sure that the lights are on at this time? Right, but I'm telling him before Shabbat. Or the other situation, it's Shabbat, and I say, tonight we're having this party, and I really, I want to hire you for the party, right? To please come and do whatever needs to be done. Can I do that on Shabbat for after Shabbat? Is that Amira La'akum? So the Avnei Nezer says it really might depend on the question of what is the Isser. If it's a question of what Shabbat's supposed to be like, so then it will be a question of whether the Melacha is being done on Shabbat itself. Whereas if I tell the non-Jew before Shabbat to do something for me on Shabbat, so I am in effect impacting on the nature of the day. Right? But the other way around. I always get this confused. The other way around. When I'm talking, I'm not doing anything wrong. It's Friday, right? So the fact that you're going to do he's going to do the work for me on Shabbat, that's not a problem, right? If on the other hand I've appointed an agent, so it doesn't matter when I made him my agent. I made it on Friday. Now he's doing it on Shabbat, and that's a problem. And just the opposite will hold true if I have him do it after Shabbat. Because I'm engaged in business talk right now, that's not appropriate on Shabbat. But the action that will be done is being done after Shabbat. And that's not a problem. So that is the question of how I view it, right, is going to make the difference. Halacha l'masa, number 15. So the Shulchan Aruch says, Asur liskor poalim, so I cannot hire workers, nor tell a non-Jew to hire workers for me on Shabbat. So I can't ask the non-Jew to hire me workers for after Shabbat. However, in the bold, aval mutar lomar lo achar Shabbat, lama lo asita davar ploni b'Shabbat sha'avar. Right? Why didn't you do this yesterday? Afal pisha mevin mitoch dvarav sheritzona she'asena b'Shabbat haba'ah. Whereas I don't tell him next, it's after Shabbat, and I tell the non-Jew, you know what? It was really dark. Why didn't you turn on the lights? So he's going to know that next Shabbat, I want him to turn on the lights, but I didn't tell him to turn on the lights. Right? Playing the game? Mm-hmm. Right? But I'm doing it after Shabbat.
Who's he fooling?
So who am I fooling? So this is part of the discussion. In other words, now we'll talk about, perhaps in the few minutes that I have left, just to talk about because the question before, after, generally speaking, halacha l'maaseh, Amira la'akum is usher for me to tell a non-Jew to do it before Shabbat, to do it on Shabbat. And it's usher for me to tell a non-Jew on Shabbat to do something after Shabbat. It's mutter for me to tell someone, if it's Friday, tell them to do Motzei Shabbat, that's okay. But if Shabbat's involved at any point, it's usher. In other words, we're going in both directions here, and we're combining the two ideas. Fine. However, what about the following situation? This is really, because if I were to say, what is the most well-known, almost halacha of Amira la'akum?
Air conditioning.
No, but I'm saying, what is, I'm saying, but in terms of the loophole of Amira la'akum, we're talking about closing loopholes, but what is the biggest open loophole?
It affects them too.
Do it for yourself.
What?
Don't tell them when to do it.
If it affects them also.
That's an important point. That's with regard to deriving hana'ah from it. But I'm talking about that's another shir. What I'm talking about asking a non-Jew. The hint, right? The hint. Nobody said it. Okay, but the hint, right? It would be really nice if there were lights here, right? That type of thing. Where does that come from? Now, this is problematic because of what you just said, namely that one thing that I haven't mentioned at all is the question, if a non-Jew comes and sees, knows that I am a little bit, that I don't know, I like tea, and he makes a cup of tea for me, and brings me the cup of tea. So, am I allowed to drink that tea? The answer is no. In other words, if it was made specifically for me, there's an isser to derive benefit. Now, I didn't ask him. Right? He's a neighbor, he's a friend. He knows that I always like my tea at a given time, and he comes and brings me my tea. And he made the tea for me on Shabbat. So it's usher for me to benefit, even though I didn't ask for him to do it. We'll talk more about that, in next time. But, so the question then becomes, what do you mean to hint to him to do it? That's also, you're benefiting from it directly, and that is problematic to derive. We have to be talking about hinting in a situation where the benefit is indirect. Okay? But leaving the indirect benefit aside for a moment. Here is the question is, why can I hint? Why don't, like you said, right? Phil said, who are you kidding?
It's not a directive.
Right? And the same way that we saw in the Gemara. The Gemara said, whoever extinguishes will not.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
So the answer seems to be that if I am talking about it from a perspective of agency, right? So then the remiza might make a difference. Whereas I didn't actually appoint him. Right? So, but if I'm talking about the if you will, the environment, so then it does make a difference. So and here there are two levels of, if you will, of remiza. And with this we'll close. So let's take a look at source 18 and source 19. The number 18 is, the Ramah says, Kol davar she'asur lomar le'eno yehudi la'asoto b'Shabbat, asur lirmoz lo la'asota. You can't hint it either. Aval mutar lirmoz lo la'asot melacha achar Shabbat. You can hint that he'd like it after the Shabbat. So again, why? Why does this make any sense whatsoever? I can't hint because it's going to be impacting on the nature of Shabbat. But if I'm hinting and it's not impacting on the nature of Shabbat because it's happening after Shabbat, so then it's okay. Okay, in other words, I didn't say anything. That was the Yisro Amira and the pointing age of it. And the impact after Shabbat, if it was just a hint, it's not a problem. Yeah.
So, say it's dark in your house, and this guy walks in.
Right.
Are you allowed to say, "Boy, it's pretty dark in here"?
Right, so here's the case. So now the Mishnah Berurah brings the following situation without getting the background of who said it before the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah is the one who's saying it here. Is the following situation. Number 19. So asur l'rmozlo, the gam zehu bichlal Amira le'eno Yehudi. If I hint, that is also included in telling the non-Jew. To the bold now. Kishaomer haremiza li'eno Yehudi shelo b'lashon tzivui. In other words, if I say it, the hint that is a direct hint is if you say, wouldn't it be nice if someone lit the light? That's a direct hint. But if I say it not as a wouldn't it be nice if someone lit the light, because that's saying to do it, but rather it's dark here, right? So then it is permissible with the proviso, because that if I could already see without the light. In other words, if it's pitch black here, right? This is as I get it, as I say, a lot of these are very technical issues. But if it's pitch black in this room, and I can't, I'm bumping into the furniture, and then you turn on the light, the non-Jew turns on the light, it becomes very problematic, without my telling him. He just walked in, right? Then it becomes problematic for me to take benefit from it.
You gotta leave the room.
Right? Maybe under certain circumstances. Generally speaking, right, it's more of a problem for if it's a Jew who lights the light. Whereas if a non-Jew lights the light, then we assume that he's doing it for himself or herself, and then you can derive benefit from that light. But if a Jew is mechalel Shabbat and lights the light, and I can't derive benefit from a Jewish person doing melacha for themselves, right? So then I might have to leave the room under certain circumstances. Usually it's not pitch black. Usually I can manage, and it's just that now the light makes things easier, right? So then it's but that's a very small case, right? People use this hinting way too wide a spectrum, because the hana has to be done in a way that it is that I would have been able to get by without the non-Jewish action. Then I can give an indirect hint, because I haven't appointed him as a shaliach, and I haven't violated because of the remizah as the overall environment of Shabbat, right? And on top of all of that, remember, and this is with this will close. Remember, the Isser is a D'Rabbanan. Okay, and I realize it's over time, but this is just a really very important thing to remember. There was a Jon Stewart I said no pop culture, but Jon Stewart in the Daily Show. So he made, when there was a Eruv controversy in Long Island, about 15 years ago. So he said the following. He said, Eruv, Hebrew for loophole. Okay? That was his thought. That was his thing. So, now, how do all of these loopholes work? He's right, but he's not right. Because these loopholes only work, and this is what's really very important to remember. We're starting with a rabbinic Isser. The Rabbanan made Isurim. Let's forget about Amira La'akum for a moment. Let's talk about the Eruv. An Eruv doesn't work where there's a D'oraita prohibition. It only works where there's a rabbinic prohibition. So now, the Rabbanan said, don't do it, even though the Torah says you can. We're saying it's too close to carrying to a D'oraita level to do it. But now I make the Eruv. So I'm basically saying I recognize that you have made this Asr, and you've given me, through the dint of the Eruv, the way to solve the rabbinic problem. So the Rabbanan then have accomplished their goal. Their goal isn't to make life miserable. Their goal is to protect the D'oraita. And by virtue of the fact that I'm only going to carry in this area where it's permissible d'oraita, only by doing the loophole, then they've accomplished what they set out to do. By the same token, in Amira la'akum, it's not usher d'oraita for me to tell the non-Jew, the way that we paskin lahalacha, it's not usher for me to tell him, I would like you to please prepare, a 10-kilo turkey, right, from start to finish, take it out, slaughter it, etc. Well, he can't slaughter it because it's but it's not usher, right? That's not usher to do. Doraita. All of that is permissible doraita. It's only usher because the Rabbanan said by doing this, right, you are undermining the quality of Shabbat, either through the technical level of creating an agent l'chumra, or that you are doing it in a way that that now the overall atmosphere has been impinged upon. Fine. So now I get that. Now you say I'm not talking anymore. I'm hinting, and I'm not giving a direct hana. So then, you've watered it down so many different levels. Like we're just assuming that it should be usher to tell the non-Jew, and you're fooling everybody by hinting. No, it should be mutter to tell the non-Jew. The Chachamim came and said, don't, because it's going to undermine the quality of Shabbat. And then when you start working with all of these different technical heterim, right, so then you are very sensitive to what's going on in terms of the nature of Shabbat, and then the Chachamim have accomplished their goal. Right? So it's just a question of your vantage point, as if are you looking at it as just a loophole which is just unacceptable, or you're looking at it as being a loophole which makes the Isser a much more palatable. Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
One of the things I appreciate about loopholes